arising in the next few weeks and months, and the first of which is going to be decided probably in as soon as it can be decided correctly, and that is, Steve, the Olympics in Beijing, scheduled for 2022, will be held on top of a slave labor economy and a politics that is absolutely arrogantly genocidal. How did they get away with this, and how can we stop it?
Well, Chris, it's great to be with you again on our weekly PRI live stream where we talk about current issues. Today, of course, the issue is China, and it's often China these days because China is clearly the biggest threat to the world, and Chinese Communist Party is the biggest threat to its own people. I have long been an opponent of holding any international game, any Asian Olympics, any Winter Olympics, Summer Olympics in China. I think the 2022 Winter Olympics, which are scheduled for February of next year, should be held anywhere but China. Now, there are a lot of people who agree with me because the voices, in fact, who are demanding that the Olympics be moved elsewhere are growing. Last September, in fact, there were 160 different human rights groups who wrote a joint letter to the International Olympic Committee, demanding that it, quote, reverse its mistake in awarding Beijing the honor of hosting the Winter Olympics. Now, this is every major human rights group in the world, representing Christians, Catholics, representing journalists, representing Buddhists, representing the minorities, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the other minorities that are being persecuted, representing political dissidents of all stripes. They all called for the Winter Olympics to be moved from Beijing. And it's not just these human rights groups. You know, in the last months of the Trump administration, for the last 6 months of the Trump administration was pushing hard on the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, to move the games elsewhere. We know this because Mike Pompeo recently held an interview in which he stated that they had been pushing for the games to be moved elsewhere. And in fact, Mike has now toughened his position even further, saying that that if the games are not moved elsewhere, moved away from Beijing, that the U.S. should boycott the Olympics, the Winter Olympics in Beijing, as we boycotted the Olympics in Moscow some decades ago, and as we should actually have boycotted the games in Berlin in 1936, when the Nazi Party used the games for political purposes to enhance its own international status and to solidify its grip on the German people. The same thing is going to happen in China, and we really shouldn't be a part of that propaganda exercise. I have great sympathy for athletes who have trained for years and years and years just for the Olympics, just for this moment. But we can hold games elsewhere. We can award medals elsewhere. And add to, of course, the Trump administration. We now have the Canadians. Just 2 weeks ago, the Canadian Parliament joined in. They voted. In fact, the vote was 400 and something to 0 against holding the Winter Olympics in Beijing unless the ongoing genocide against the Uyghur minority in the far west of China was ended. Now, Canada is not known as being often on the front lines of these issues, especially where China is concerned, but it's gotten out ahead of us, calling for the games to be moved away from Beijing. There are multiple reasons for moving them away. I mean, if we wanted to list all the human rights abuses that happen in China, we could be here all day. But let me give you the summary version. You've got the ongoing Uyghur genocide, mass incarceration, forced abortion, forced sterilization, modern day slavery, gang rape. All that tops the list of what Mike Pompeo has called China's nasty activity. But it certainly does not exhaust it. You've got the same thing happening in the Tibetan region, for example, with mass incarceration, with the effort to dilute and ultimately destroy the national identity of the Tibetan people. You've got the persecution of Catholics You've got the persecution of Christians, Buddhists, Taoists, anybody with a religious faith in China is suspect these days. Ancient Buddhist monasteries and modern Catholic churches are being torn down in that country. And then you've got political dissidents, you've got journalists, you've got attorneys in China. And now you've got the crushing of Hong Kong. 7.5 million free people now being crushed under the hobnail boot of the Chinese Communist Party in real time, in full view of the whole world. So, what you see happening in China now is probably, taken all together, the worst human rights abuses in the world today, because you've got every kind of abuse happening. If gold medals were given for human rights abuses, China would win all the golds, hands down, hands down. So what's also going to happen in China leading up to the Winter Olympics is this: the persecution is going to grow even more intense. More intense. We saw that in the 2008 Olympic Games, which were held in Beijing. What happened in the months leading up to the 2008 Games? Well, they went in, they tore down everything they regarded as a slum. They just bought in the bulldozers and bulldozed people's houses, left tens of thousands of people homeless. Everyone who wasn't a resident of Beijing was kicked out of the city. All political dissidents, anyone they thought might cause problems during the 2008 Games, was arrested, sent to prison camps, labor camps, re-education camps. They painted the dead grass green. I mean that literally. There was dead grass in the city of Beijing that they literally spray painted green to make things look good. You've heard of Potemkin villages in Russia? Well, this was Potemkin grass in China. But along with painting the dead grass green and sweeping up all the trash in the city, they also swept up anybody who could possibly criticize the regime. So that same thing is going to happen again. So it's not just that we have a terrible human rights situation in China right now. We will be contributing to increased human rights abuses in China over the next year by holding the Winter Games in China. You see, that will actually spark, cause, generate persecution. That means that we're all complicit. Everybody who wants to watch the games, everybody who goes to the games, all the athletes, all the countries that participate are actually made complicit in the ongoing persecution, destruction of ethnicities, genocide against the Uyghurs, persecution of Catholics and Christians. The list goes on and on and on.
Steve,
and then I have one more comment to make about these stadiums. They build these stadiums for the games, right? In the 2008 Games, they built them for soccer competitions and for other open air athletic competitions. But they also use them for executions. They also use them to carry out mass public executions. They will gather 50,000 people in a football stadium. They will bring in someone who's been sentenced to death, and in full view of all the men, women, and children in the stands, they will force that individual to his knees and they will kill him with a bullet to the back of the head. Sometimes it's an individual execution. Sometimes they execute 5 or 10 or more people at a time. So these athletic stadiums that they will build, it's not just about the giant slalom and the ice hockey and all the rest. Once the games are over, these venues will be used for other purposes, and they're not fun and games.
Well, that brings to mind the 1936 to 39 battle in the Spanish Civil War, where the communists used the soccer stadium in Barcelona as a killing ground for priests and nuns. Thousands of priests, nuns, seminarians, and others connected with the church. And in those days, the church was flourishing in the Spanish Republic.
Right.
And it calls to mind, of course, afterwards, there were thousands of ordinations over the years in the New Spain under Franco, when the Catholic Church was revivified and treated well by the Franco government. Now you have what sounds like a gold medal being and China gets the first gold medal in the Olympics by being able to hold them. Now, what is the United States doing under the Biden administration to fortify this plea to move the Olympics elsewhere?
Well, there's a lot we don't know about the Biden administration's policy towards China, and I think we'll know more after the upcoming meeting between the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, and his Chinese counterpart, the Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the one in the Politburo who holds the foreign ministry portfolio, the foreign affairs portfolio. That meeting is going to be held in Alaska. And of course, I say tongue in cheek, I hope the Biden administration does not sell Alaska to China. The only reason a joke like that is funny is because there's always a kernel of truth in it. Will they sell out to China? And I don't know what the outcome of the meeting will be, but I fear that we're going to be going back to the old Obama-Biden foreign policy of trying to bribe countries into good behavior. In order to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, we'll send them $1 billion, and then we'll expect them to behave. In order to stop North Korea from putting nuclear weapons on warheads and pointing them on nuclear missiles and pointing them in our direction, we're going to give them billions of dollars. That approach doesn't work with dictators. Dictatorships only respect strength. You punish them for bad behavior, you sanction them for bad behavior, and you lift the sanctions when they stop the bad behavior. You never, ever reward them. So there should be no reward given to China. Certainly, China has not stopped stealing intellectual property. They've not stopped sending over spies, PLA scientists to infiltrate our university research labs and steal high-tech information useful for their own military development. They've not stopped dumping cheap Chinese-made goods on our markets. They have failed to keep the second round of the tariff agreement with us that they signed last January, pledging to buy $200 billion worth of American-made goods. They haven't done that. There should be sanctions imposed for failing to meet that agreement that they signed at the beginning of the China virus pandemic. And if they say, well, we couldn't meet our obligation under the agreement because there was the pandemic raging around the world, the proper response is yes, and you caused it, and therefore you're responsible not just to meet your obligation of $200 billion in purchases of American-made goods, you have an obligation to pay reparations to the world for the trillions of dollars of damage that your pandemic has caused to the world's economy, not to mention the deaths. So back to the Beijing Olympics, just to wrap up. With that, I don't know what the position of the Biden administration will be vis-a-vis the Olympics, but just to solidify in people's minds, when the international media arrives in Beijing next year, they will find the city sterilized of all possible unrest. They will find surveillance cameras on every street corner. They will find facial recognition technology utilized to identify possible dissidents, possible dissent. They'll find more artificial intelligence processing data in real time. The population in and around Beijing will be monitored in real time, and any dissent will be snuffed out before it happens. All this is to say, the games will not bring change to China, but instead generate a new wave of persecution. And then once the Winter Olympics of 2022 are over and the foreign press and athletes leave, the playing fields will once again become killing fields as well. And at the highest level, the Olympic Games are a celebration of the human spirit. It's not just about ice hockey or the toboggan run. It's about the efforts of individual men and women to be the best that they can be in every field of human endeavor, athletic endeavor, to excel. And this is why, the game should always be held in countries where human rights are respected. And this is why Beijing, where that overarching spirit of freedom is violated every day, is such a bad choice for the Winter Olympics of 2022.
Well, Steve, there is a history in the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, of corruption. When you talk about selling Alaska to the Chinese, whom did China buy on the International Olympic Committee to get this award, this gold medal from the international sports community to be able to host this event at all? There was a fellow back in the 2004 named Samaranch. He was the head of the International Olympic Committee, and he was so corrupt that when they forced him to retire because he was taking so much money from third world countries, most of them tyrants, most of them corrupt, of course, that he insisted on having $1 million pension a year from the committee and a beautiful villa in Lake Geneva in return for leaving at all. So these people buy and they can be bought. So tell me how is that going to play, that dialectic, coming up to the point of no return with regard to making the decision to either leave the Olympics there, to cancel them, or to move them?
Well, Beijing won the 2022 Winter Olympics over a bid from Kazakhstan. There were other countries originally in the running, but in those countries, there was popular resistance, public resistance to holding the games in those cities. And I wonder if the public resistance wasn't in part paid for and organized by the People's Republic of China. They're very good at those kinds of united front tactics, working through groups in other countries. And we see that here in our own country with their support that they've given to Antifa, for example, and to BLM. But going back to the final contestants, there were two, Kazakhstan and People's Republic of China. And the People's Republic of China won by 4 votes. Now, I don't know, and you don't know, what sort of bribes were paid or were not paid for those votes. But we do know this. We do know that this is typical behavior on the part of the Chinese Communist Party. Recently, a well-known professor of international politics in Beijing, on a video presentation to his class, was laughing about how easy it was to buy American politicians. And he said, if the first bag of money doesn't do the trick, this is speaking in Chinese, of course, if the first bag of money doesn't do the trick, the next time we give 2 bags of money, and eventually they do what we want. So we know that they advance their cause by corruption, by bribery, by suborning officials in other countries. And so it wouldn't surprise me if there was a lot of that went on into buying the Beijing Games for the winter of 2022.
Well, moving on from the Olympic question, which is certainly going to have a dimension of buying and being bought, what is the United States doing with China with regard to the vaccine, the virus? Donald Trump was very firm in his opposition to China's stonewalling on the source and the distribution and spread of the China virus. It became illegal in public discourse to even mention China with regard to the virus. It was almost a mortal sin with regard to the international moral standard. Where does that stand now? And what is the future? Doesn't China have a vaccine, for instance, that it's peddling itself?
Well, it does. It has several vaccines which are in trials around the world, being tried right now, not on rats or laboratory animals, but being tried on human beings in countries like Brazil and elsewhere. But back to the question of the origin of the China virus, we now are beginning to see even the mainstream media begin to focus on the fact that the virus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. It's now becoming acceptable to talk about that. The evidence is really overwhelming, and we've gone over the evidence in past episodes, so we don't need to rehearse it all here. But I would say that we're seeing more and more mainstream publications talk about the fact that this came from the lab. Now, they'll still say it was collected in the lab and they were experimenting on the lab, but they will balk at suggesting that it was part of a bioweapons program. And I will insist, however, that China has had a bioweapons program in place for decades, that all laboratories in China, whether or not they're military or civilian, all work together on projects like this, because everybody in China is at the beck and call of the Chinese Communist Party. Everybody has a responsibility to answer the party's call to help on such matters as scientific research on weapons that can be used against other populations, against the China's enemies overseas. So the idea that there was no PLA involvement in the development of this China virus simply doesn't make sense to me as a China hand. Now, I'm worried now about the fact that the People's Republic of China has been collecting DNA for years around the world. I wrote a series of articles in a publication called the Epoch Times a year and a half ago about China's massive DNA collection effort. And I started by talking about the massive DNA collection effort within China itself. They started by collecting all of the DNA from minorities, all of the DNA from minorities, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, all the rest. And then they focused on collecting DNA from men, the heads of families. And now they're collecting in China DNA from every single individual in China. This is a massive DNA collection effort. There are over 1 billion people in China, of course. Why do they want everyone's DNA? Well, it's a mechanism of political control. If you have a crime committed and you have DNA evidence and you have a massive database of everyone's DNA, it's child's play to identify the criminal, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So, and that's what's happening within China. And because they set up this massive DNA collection effort, they have become very, very good at DNA analysis and very, very cheap at DNA analysis. So with China right now has the largest DNA database in the world. It has tens of millions of samples of DNA from overseas, not talking now about the tens of millions of samples of DNA from Chinese. We're talking about tens of millions of samples of DNA from overseas. Where do they get those samples? Well, anyone who goes into sending a sample of their saliva to one of these, what do we want to call them? Genetic analyses groups. I don't want to necessarily name them, but there is 23andMe and some other ones. It turns out, because I've checked with them, that most of these DNA firms that tell you where your ancestors come from, Germany, Ireland, Scotland, Spain, Portugal, Italy, send their DNA for analysis to China. Now, why do they send it to China? Well, because China has a greater ability to analyze DNA and do it more cheaply than any other country, any other firm in the world. And the reason they're doing this is because it's government subsidized and it's part of a massive DNA collection program run by the People's Liberation Army to gather information to create bioweapons that target specific ethnic groups. Okay? Let me be clear. The China virus is not going to be the last pathogen that comes from China. We're going to have, we may have COVID-20, COVID-2021. We've got to be concerned that the next disease will be even more transmissible and more deadly than the China virus was. And the reason is that while they're collecting DNA from their own citizens in China for purposes of law enforcement, right? And tracking down dissidents and having a tightly controlled surveillance state. They're not collecting DNA from us for that reason. They're collecting DNA from us because they want to know what the distinctive elements of the Caucasian and African and Japanese and Korean, the DNA of all these other folks, so they can develop specific viruses that target people with that genetic profile. So it's a very dangerous thing that's happening. And this has been going on for years. I mean, back in 2015, the PRC hacked into Anthem. Now, a lot of people have insurance through Anthem, Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's the second largest insurance company in the United States. So they gathered a tremendous amount of health data from Anthem, and the hacking continues. They are doing everything they can to enlarge their DNA database. Also, they have told the World Health Organization, let them manage the QR codes that should be stamped on passports for travel around the world. China has said, we will run that program for you. And why would they want to do that? Because the QR code would tell them a lot about who's been vaccinated, who hasn't been vaccinated, and presumably would also contain health information. So, and the vaccine trials themselves, China is using what I call vaccine diplomacy. They say to a country, we will give you the vaccine, but we're going to have to test it on your population. And so if you want to participate in these trials and be protected against the China virus that we unleashed on you, they don't say that, of course, then unless you participate in these trials, you're not getting the Chinese vaccine. So if you get the Chinese vaccine and you participate in these trials, you have to turn over the health information, in some cases, including the DNA of the people who get the vaccine, to China. So it's trying to extend its influence by making its vaccine available and collecting lots of very sensitive information about people outside of China. And China actually has, I think I said earlier, 3 vaccines. China now has 5 coronavirus vaccines that have reached phase 3 clinical trials. And they've been carried out. The final phase 3 of the trials, has been rolled out in 16 different countries, including Brazil, Turkey, Morocco, and the UAE. And I will tell you, I wouldn't take a vaccine made in China. I have a problem with vaccines in general, but that's a topic for another day. But you can see that this is also a massive DNA health data collection effort. And the reason it's massive is because China has a program called Made in China 2025. And it identifies 11 areas, high-tech areas, that China wants to dominate within the next 4 years, because we're already in 2021. And one of those 11 high-tech areas is genomics. They want to dominate genetic research. And they don't want to do it just to cure cancer or to cure, heritable diseases of various kinds. They want to do it because they're developing right now bioweapons to target non-Chinese. Imagine how effective that would be if China wanted to invade India, for example, and carve off part of Indian territory and add it to Greater China. Imagine how effective that invasion might be if they released a virus that targeted Indian citizens, but left the Chinese themselves unscathed. So that's what's going on.
Well, Steve, with that in mind, it sounds like I took a trip recently where I could use 5G for a week. And it's very seductive. I recall having had to do dial-up over the few years that I first got online. And when you get DSL, you don't want to go back to dial-up. And when it comes to 5G, it's, as a musician, I mean, it changes one's schedule because it changes the speed with which you can download and transmit and share.
Yeah.
Now, it sounds to me like the 5G, if you use it as a concept, China is in a position to collect intellectual DNA, that is the talks we have here, the Google and other, Facebook and all the rest, if they have the 5G, and of course, financial. Very quickly, the Chinese will have enough information on anybody who uses 21st century technology in the United States to put together their own prospective social credit system that they have in China already, so that it'll be flip the switch, and the United States could immediately identify that 10% or 20% of the population that has to be shut down or shut off, and the 10% on whom they can rely 100%, and that leaves 70, maybe 2/3 of the population in Orwell's terms that would be proles out there in the working world. This is not science fiction anymore.
No, it's not, and it's very, very dangerous for us. 5G is one of the 11 areas that the Made in China 2025 plan identifies, the high-tech, high ground that China wants to capture and control in the future. And this would be the Internet of Things. This would be the 5G network would control things like self-driving cars. It would control power plants. It would control transportation networks. If you allow China to set up a 5G network in your country with Chinese-made routers, they will have backdoors in them that can be remotely accessed from Beijing, and they will have kill switches on them so that the electricity can be turned off, the water can be turned off, the self-driving cars can be made to go mad or stop driving altogether. So this is a very dangerous development, and it's one of the reasons why the Trump administration was so insistent that China's main 5G company, Huawei, not be allowed to build networks not only in the United States, but in our countries in Europe that we're allied to as part of NATO. And the good news is that throughout the last year and a half, 2 years of the Trump administration, we got almost all of our allies to commit not to use Huawei 5G. In other words, not to bring in this Chinese 5G Trojan horse that could be used to attack us from inside our own countries in the event of a conflict. We did have a problem with Italy. Italy has a lot of 5G equipment in place and apparently is going to keep it in place. So the soft underbelly of Europe has given way to Chinese pressure. But Great Britain, which also installed a lot of Huawei 5G equipment, is now ripping it out. And it's ripping it out at great cost, I think primarily because the China virus has caused so much damage in the UK. They're now going into the third lockdown. The lockdowns are another question, of course. So Boris Johnson was very sick, hospitalized with the China virus. And after that, he came out and the decision came down that Huawei 5G had no place in Great Britain. And of course, Great Britain has been horrified by the crushing of Hong Kong and by the blatant violation of the Sino-British agreement that was supposed to be in place until 2047, supposed to remain in place for another quarter century. And they've now torn it up and turned Hong Kong into just another dismal Chinese city under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. So that's 5G. Basically, to sum up, Chris, today's talk, we need to decouple from China. We should not allow any American DNA, for example, to go to China. That has to stop immediately because of the danger of the development of genetically targeted bioweapons targeted at us. We have to stop Chinese technology like 5G from coming into our country. And there are other things that we have to do as well. We need a complete decoupling from this country, which uses every contact we have with China is used by them to advance their interests and to undermine ours. So the idea that you can negotiate your way out of this this struggle, this long twilight struggle that we're engaged in with China is nonsense. Agreements mean nothing to them. They're only a temporary expedient to gain a strategic advantage. When it no longer advantages them, they tear up the agreement and move on. So we need to build up our defenses in Asia. We need to shut down Confucius Institutes in the United States, send Chinese spies packing by the thousands, and decouple in other ways from China as well.
Well, we have to be prayerful about the prospects, which might not be good. And your humble servant and 22 million other people had our records on file with the Obama Office of Personnel Management, which was lax in its security, and the Chinese Communist Party, a controlled entity, whoever, took all of our files, including the security files that were involved in getting our clearances in the first place, including all the raw data from interviews that the investigators gathered from around our resume entries. So it sounds to me like they are gathering a gold mine, not a gold medal, but a gold mine of information of all kinds that they can use against the enemy. And as Peanuts who used to say, we have discussed Pogo, we have found the enemy and he is us. And in the case of China, we are the enemy and they are ours. And I hope that we can proceed prudently without collapsing our forces, which still remain to us. So we're going to be back in 2 weeks, folks, to continue this conversation on a wide spectrum of issues. We are grateful to have Steve Mosher with us today. I'm Chris Manion from the Population Research Institute headquarters in Front Royal, Virginia. Thanks for joining us today.